The first time the police knocked on my door, I honestly believed there had been a mistake. I remember wiping flour from my hands because I had been baking my late mother's cinnamon bread, the one recipe that always made me feel like she was still with me. When I opened the door, 2 officers stood there with polite but serious expressions. "Ma'am, we've received a complaint about loud screaming coming from your house." I stared at them. "What screaming?" My voice barely rose above a whisper. "They searched the property with my permission." Every room was silent. My television wasn't even on. After a few awkward minutes, they apologized and left. I laughed about it, until they came back. 3 days later, then again the following week. Soon, every Thursday evening became a nightmare. The flashing blue and red lights reflected through my windows before sunset, making my heart race before anyone even knocked. My neighbors peeked through their curtains. Children pointed at my house. People who had once waved at me during morning walks suddenly avoided eye contact. Someone had decided to destroy my reputation one police visit at a time. I lived alone after my husband Daniel passed away from cancer 2 years earlier. We had never been able to have children, and after losing him, the quiet little house we had built together became both my shelter and my prison. I worked remotely as a book editor, rarely disturbed anyone, and spent weekends tending roses in the front yard Daniel had planted. I couldn't understand why anyone would target me. The answer lived next door. Her name was Linda. The day she moved in, she smiled so warmly that I baked cookies to welcome her. She hugged me and said, "It's wonderful having kind neighbors." 3 weeks later, she reported me to the homeowners association because my hedge was supposedly 2 inches too tall. Then she complained that my bird feeder attracted wildlife. Then she accused me of leaving trash bins outside too long. Everything she said was technically small enough that nobody cared. Until the police calls started. Every single report was anonymous. Every report described something different. Domestic violence, drug activity, late-night parties, illegal construction, animal abuse. Each accusation sounded so convincing that officers had no choice but to investigate. Every investigation ended exactly the same. Nothing. But after the 6th visit, I noticed something had changed. The officers no longer looked apologetic. They looked suspicious. One evening, as they searched my backyard after another anonymous complaint, one officer quietly asked, "Mrs. Carter, are you sure everything is all right here?" The question hurt more than I expected. Because for the first time, someone actually wondered if I was lying. I smiled anyway. "I'm sure." But after they left, I sat on my kitchen floor and cried until midnight. I wasn't crying because of the police. I was crying because whoever was doing this wanted me isolated. And it was working. The mail carrier stopped chatting with me. Parents pulled their children away from my sidewalk. Even my closest friend, Evelyn, hesitated before asking, "You're not in some kind of trouble, are you?" I realized then that innocence doesn't protect your reputation. People don't remember cleared accusations. They remember police cars. One Saturday morning, I walked outside to water my roses when Linda appeared beside our shared fence. She folded her arms and smiled. "You certainly have visitors often." I forced a smile. "Apparently." She tilted her head. "Some people bring problems wherever they go." For a second, I saw something behind her smile. Not curiosity, satisfaction. As she walked away, I noticed something odd. She didn't look back at me. She looked at my front porch security camera. Almost as if she already knew exactly where it pointed. That tiny detail stayed in my mind all day. A week later, another police visit came. This time someone claimed I was threatening neighbors with a firearm. The officers searched my house. I didn't even own a gun. When they finished, one younger officer quietly said, "I don't believe these complaints anymore." His older partner immediately interrupted. "We still have to respond." Of course they did. The law required it. Whoever was calling understood that perfectly. That night, instead of crying, I opened a notebook. Across the first page I wrote one sentence. "If someone is trying this hard to ruin my life, they're making a mistake." Because desperate people always leave patterns. And patterns leave evidence. I spent the next several days doing something Linda never expected. I stopped defending myself. Instead, I started paying attention. Every police visit happened within 15 minutes of Linda returning home from work. Every complaint came on days she worked from home the following morning. Every time officers left my property, I caught the faintest glimpse of her curtain moving upstairs. She wasn't just hearing about the investigations. She was watching them, watching me, watching every piece of my life slowly fall apart. Then, one rainy Thursday evening, I accidentally saw something that changed everything. I was bringing groceries inside when Linda hurried across her driveway, holding her phone tightly against her ear. She didn't notice me standing behind my garage. I just made the report, she whispered, laughing softly. Give it 10 minutes. They'll be here again. She ended the call before I could hear another word. Exactly 9 minutes later, flashing lights appeared at the end of our street. The officers walked toward my door once again. But this time, as they knocked, I wasn't scared anymore. For the first time in months, I knew I wasn't imagining the pattern. I just didn't know yet that proving it legally would require more patience than I had ever shown anyone, and that Linda had already made one fatal mistake she believed no one would ever notice. I let the officers finish their inspection exactly as I always had. I remained calm, answered every question politely, and thanked them before closing the door. The moment their patrol car disappeared around the corner, I walked into my office, opened my notebook, and added another line beneath the growing list of dates and times. She made the call before they arrived. It wasn't proof. It was only an observation. But observations become evidence when they're repeated. From that day on, I stopped reacting emotionally and started thinking like an editor. My job had taught me that every good story had a pattern. Every lie eventually contradicted itself. I only needed to find where Linda's story stopped making sense. I adjusted my security cameras so they captured more of the front street without invading anyone's privacy. I installed another camera facing my own driveway and porch. I kept every recording carefully organized by date. Every police visit, every strange moment, every time Linda lingered near her curtains after the officers arrived. Weeks passed. The complaints didn't stop. If anything, they became even more outrageous. One report claimed I was running an illegal daycare. Another accused me of burning hazardous chemicals in my backyard. Then someone insisted I was keeping dangerous animals inside my home. Each investigation ended exactly like the last. Nothing. The responding officers gradually became familiar faces. Some even recognized me before stepping out of their vehicles. One afternoon, Officer Ramirez sighed as he approached my porch. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Carter. You don't have to apologize," I answered gently. "You're doing your job." He hesitated before lowering his voice. "I've been reviewing these calls. They're unusual." I looked directly at him. "So have I." For a brief second, neither of us said another word. He couldn't accuse the anonymous caller without evidence. And I couldn't accuse Linda without it either. The law demanded facts, not feelings. That realization became my greatest advantage. Instead of trying to convince people Linda was guilty, I focused entirely on collecting facts. I requested copies of every police report filed at my address. Page after page filled a thick binder on my dining room table. Reading them all together revealed something I had missed. The anonymous caller always sounded terrified. The wording changed, but the emotional tone never did. Every report insisted there was an emergency happening, right now. Every caller claimed to be watching from nearby. Yet no responding officer had ever found another witness. Not one. I shared my growing file with attorney Melissa Grant, a woman Daniel and I had hired years earlier when we purchased the house. She listened quietly while turning each page. When she finally looked up, her expression had changed. "Emily," she said carefully, "someone isn't just bothering you. I know. They're abusing emergency services." I nodded. "But suspicion isn't enough." She smiled faintly. "No." She tapped the binder. "But documentation changes everything." She advised me to continue recording every incident, avoid confronting Linda, and let the evidence speak for itself. That turned out to be the hardest advice I'd ever followed. Because Linda became bolder. She began waving cheerfully whenever police cars arrived. Sometimes she'd stand outside watering flowers while officers searched my property. Once she even asked loudly enough for nearby neighbors to hear, "Everything all right over there?" The sympathy in her voice sounded almost believable. Almost. One evening, I noticed something through my porch camera that made my pulse quicken. Linda stepped outside moments after another patrol car left. She looked around to make sure nobody was watching. Then she walked toward my mailbox. She didn't touch it. Instead, she took several photographs before quickly returning home. Why photograph my mailbox? I replayed the footage 5 times. Then 10. Finally I enlarged the image. A small reflection appeared in her sunglasses. It wasn't clear enough to identify much. But one object stood out unmistakably. A phone pressed against her ear. She had been talking to someone while photographing my property. Melissa examined the footage the next morning. "It's still not enough," she admitted. "I know. But," she leaned back thoughtfully, People who become this confident usually overplay their hand. I didn't understand what she meant. Until the following Thursday, around 6 o'clock, my doorbell rang again. This time it wasn't the police. It was a delivery driver carrying 3 expensive electronic devices addressed to my house. I had never ordered them. Within 20 minutes, officers arrived responding to an anonymous report claiming I had stolen packages from neighborhood porches. Everything suddenly clicked. The packages had been bait. Someone expected them to appear on my porch before calling the police. Fortunately, my doorbell camera recorded the entire delivery, including the driver's confirmation that the packages matched the shipping label. The officers reviewed the footage immediately. For the first time since this nightmare began, one of them smiled. This complaint doesn't add up. They documented everything before leaving. Across the street, Linda watched from behind her curtains. She looked confused, almost disappointed. She had expected another successful humiliation. Instead, nothing happened. That night Melissa called me. I think she's getting careless. What do? We wait. Wait for what? For the mistake that connects all the pieces. The mistake came sooner than either of us expected. The following Monday morning, a detective contacted me requesting a meeting. Not because I was under investigation. Because someone inside the department had noticed something impossible. Every anonymous emergency call about my home had been made from different phone numbers. Disposable numbers. But every single one had connected to the exact same cellular tower sector, within seconds of Linda arriving home from work. It still wasn't enough for an arrest. But for the first time, law enforcement wasn't investigating me. They were investigating whoever had spent months trying to destroy my life. And while Linda still believed I was trapped inside the nightmare she had created, she had no idea that the walls were already closing around her. When I walked into the detective's office, I felt the same nervousness I had felt every time police officers knocked on my door. The difference was that this time, I wasn't sitting there as the person everyone questioned. I was finally being treated as the person who had been harmed. Detective Harris spread several folders across the table. "Mrs. Carter," he said calmly, "we're not making accusations yet. We're following evidence." I nodded. "That's all I've wanted from the beginning." He pointed to a timeline that looked remarkably similar to the notebook I had kept for months. Every emergency call, every police response, every report, every date and time had been organized side by side. "Your records filled in gaps we didn't have." For the first time since Daniel died, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Someone believed me. Over the next few weeks, investigators quietly gathered more information. They didn't alert Linda. They didn't confront her. They simply watched, documented, and waited. Meanwhile, I continued living exactly as I always had. I watered my roses, edited manuscripts, baked cinnamon bread, and every time Linda looked at me with that smug little smile, I smiled back. She mistook my peace for defeat. One Thursday afternoon, another anonymous emergency call came in. The caller claimed I had assaulted an elderly neighbor and was destroying evidence inside my house. The responding officers already knew the pattern. Instead of rushing in blindly, they followed standard procedure while another investigative team quietly monitored the neighborhood. As expected, Linda stepped outside. She pretended to trim her hedges while watching every movement. Then she walked back inside. Minutes later, investigators obtained exactly what they had been waiting for. Records connected the latest disposable phone activation to a payment method that had been used before. The purchase had been made with a rewards account. An account registered in Linda's own name. It wasn't the only mistake. Security footage from a nearby convenience store showed her buying several prepaid phones over different weeks. The timestamps matched multiple false emergency reports. Then investigators recovered additional surveillance footage from another business. There she was again, buying another disposable phone, smiling, looking completely relaxed. Piece by piece, the anonymous caller disappeared. Linda took her place. When officers knocked on her door the following morning, I watched quietly through my living room window. It was the first time police had come for someone else's house. She answered with the same confidence I'd seen for months. Within minutes, that confidence disappeared. Her face turned pale. She looked across the street at me. I simply stood there. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I just watched. Exactly the way she had watched me. Over the following months, the truth unfolded in court. Investigators proved she had filed dozens of knowingly false emergency reports. She had intentionally abused emergency services, created false allegations, attempted to damage my reputation, and caused repeated unnecessary police responses. The evidence didn't rely on my opinion. It relied on records, video, purchase history, phone data, police reports, my notebook. Everything fit together like pieces of a puzzle. When Linda finally testified, she insisted she had only been trying to protect the neighborhood. The judge calmly asked one question. If you believed every accusation was true, why did you repeatedly hide your identity? She couldn't answer. The silence said everything. The court found her responsible for the false reports and ordered her to pay substantial financial penalties, reimburse investigative costs where permitted, and compensate me for the legal expenses and measurable harm caused by her months-long campaign. She was also prohibited from making further contact or harassment through a court order. Money wasn't what mattered. The peace was. Several weeks later, a moving truck pulled into Linda's driveway. I watched from my porch as strangers loaded furniture into the trailer. She glanced toward my house one last time. Her expression wasn't angry anymore. It was exhausted. She looked away first. By sunset, the house next door was empty. The silence that followed felt different from the loneliness I had known after Daniel died. This silence felt safe. A month later, my new neighbors arrived. A young couple with a little girl who immediately wandered toward my rose garden. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "Would you like one?" I asked. Her eyes lit up. Together we picked a single pink rose. Her parents smiled warmly. "We've heard wonderful things about you." For a second, I couldn't speak. Those simple words healed wounds I hadn't realized I was still carrying. The whispers had disappeared. The suspicious looks were gone. The neighborhood that had once watched flashing police lights outside my home now waved as I walked past. Officer Ramirez even stopped one afternoon while driving through the area. "No complaints today," he joked. "I hope you're getting bored." He laughed. "Honestly, that's exactly how I like my job." After he drove away, I sat on my front porch with a cup of coffee and looked at Daniel's roses swaying gently in the evening breeze. I thought revenge would feel like watching Linda lose everything. It didn't. The real victory wasn't seeing her held accountable. It was realizing she no longer occupied space in my mind. She had spent months trying to convince everyone that I was the problem. In the end, I never screamed, never threatened, never lied, never sought to ruin her life. I simply trusted the law, documented the truth, and let her own choices become the evidence against her. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, I smiled for the first time in a very long while. Not because I had defeated my neighbor, but because I had finally reclaimed the quiet life she could never take from me.